Imagine you wake up one morning, and you are no longer you. Not in a dramatic sense. There's no sudden crisis. No emergency call in the early hours. No missing person report filed somewhere during the night. Instead, what has shifted is something quieter, something slower, a gradual, almost invisible change in how the world around you recognizes you. And when you begin to trace it back, all of it leads to a single form that you may have signed without reading a single line of it carefully. That might sound unlikely. Most people would push the idea away without much thought. After all, forms are one of the most ordinary things in modern life. We encounter them constantly and without ceremony. At hospitals, when we register for an appointment. At banks, when we open an account. At government offices, when we apply for a document we need. At new jobs on the first day. When a stack of paperwork is placed in front of us, and we're simply expected to work through it. Forms are routine. They are expected. And because they are so expected, they are almost never examined carefully. You are handed a page. You sign where you are told to sign. You hand it back. You move on. And then you forget it ever existed. That forgetting, it turns out, may be exactly where the problem begins. Consider how many forms a person signs in a single year. A conservative estimate, accounting for healthcare visits, financial transactions, employment documents, and government interactions, would place the number well into the dozens. Each of those documents contains terms. Each contains language that carries legal weight. And in almost every case, the moment of signing is also the moment of least attention. There is rarely time. There is rarely a strong reason to slow down. And so the signature is given, and the document moves on without the person who signed it knowing where it goes. Because forms are not simply pieces of paper. They are legal instruments. They create agreements. And those agreements do not always end at the edge of the page you can see. Sometimes they extend into clauses written in language that most people would need a specialist to fully interpret. Sometimes they authorize connections to other systems, other databases, other institutions, connections that are technically disclosed somewhere in the document but practically invisible to anyone reading quickly. The form you sign in one place does not always stay in one place. It enters a system. It connects to other systems and other records. And that process begins almost the moment you hand it back across the counter, usually before you have even left the building. It is also worth considering what happens to a form after it leaves your hands. Most people imagine that it goes into a filing system somewhere, physical or digital, and that it stays there, static, waiting in case anyone needs to refer to it. That image is largely incorrect. In many institutional settings, a submitted form does not simply rest in a file. It triggers processes. It updates connected records. It may be shared with partner organizations, regulatory bodies, or third-party service providers whose involvement is authorized somewhere in the document's terms. The form travels, and it travels through systems that the person who signed it has no visibility into and no ongoing relationship with. This raises a question that does not have a simple answer. What happens when a form does more than collect your information? What happens when that form, the ordinary, forgettable one you signed while someone waited behind you in a queue, quietly authorizes the transfer of your details to a third party you have never heard of, or allows an institution to update your records in ways you were not clearly told about, or gives another organization the right to reclassify information about you that you had always considered settled? These are not hypothetical scenarios lifted from a legal textbook. They are situations that people have described from direct experience, and that distinction matters. Most people assume there are protections in place that would prevent this from becoming a real problem. In principle, they are not wrong. There are laws governing how personal data is collected and used. There are regulations that require consent. There are oversight bodies meant to ensure that institutions follow the rules they have agreed to follow. The official framework, as it is described in public documents and regulatory guidance, appears thorough. It appears sufficient. And for most people, in most situations, it probably is. But the edge cases, the situations where the system does not behave the way it is described, are more common than the official picture suggests. And the people who end up inside those edge cases rarely saw them coming. It is also worth considering the environment in which most forms are signed. A hospital admissions desk is designed for processing people quickly, not for careful reading. A bank counter is built around throughput. A human resources office on someone's first working day is focused on completing necessary paperwork so that the actual job can begin. These are not environments that invite pausing, questioning, or asking for additional time to review a document. They are environments where signing is the expected and efficient response. And yet, they are precisely the environments where the most consequential identity-related documents are most commonly introduced. The context itself creates pressure against the kind of attention these documents would actually require. That is not an accusation directed at any particular institution. It is an observation about how the process is structured, and what that structure implicitly asks of the person on the other side of the counter. At first, all of this seems like background information, normal, unremarkable, but there is a problem that emerges once you look at it from a different angle. The legal framework for identity protection is built on the concept of consent. A person agrees to how their information is used. They confirm they understand the terms. They sign, and by signing, they accept responsibility for what follows. That is the theory. But consent, in the way it is actually practiced in these settings, is rarely the clear and considered agreement the theory assumes. Research into how people engage with legal documents has repeatedly found that most individuals do not read the full text of the agreements they sign. This is not because people are careless. It is because the volume of agreement that modern life requires is simply too large to read carefully every time. If a person were to read every terms and conditions document, every consent form, every data sharing agreement they encounter in an average year, the time required would stretch well beyond what any practical daily life could accommodate. The system operates on the assumption of informed consent, but in many cases, the consent is formal rather than informed, and the gap between those two things is where certain problems take root. There is another dimension to this that tends to be overlooked. Even when people do attempt to read the documents placed in front of them, the language itself presents a barrier. Legal and institutional language is not designed for general readability. It is designed for precision that protects the institution in the event of a dispute, and that requires a specific kind of training to interpret fully. A person reading a standard data-sharing consent form is almost certainly not reading it in the same way that the legal team that drafted it would read it. The words are the same. The meanings are not. And that asymmetry between the document's plain appearance and its actual legal implications is rarely acknowledged at the moment of signing. Some people have encountered the consequences of that gap directly, not in theory, in their actual records. There are documented cases across different countries, different types of institutions, different categories of personal data, where individuals completed what appeared to be a routine form and discovered, weeks or months later, that something in their official record had changed. A name recorded with a different spelling than they had ever used. A date of birth appearing differently than it appears on every document they have ever held. An address listed in their profile that they have no connection to. A classification applied to their financial or medical record that they did not recognize, had not requested, and could not immediately account for. At first, most of these individuals assumed a clerical error was responsible. That is the reasonable response. Data entry is imperfect. Systems make mistakes. The simplest explanation is usually the right one, and so most people begin with the obvious path. They contact the institution. They explain that something is wrong. They ask for the mistake to be corrected. That seems like a straightforward process, and it should be. But this is where it becomes unclear. The correction process, in case after case, turned out to be significantly more complicated than the error itself appeared to justify. To fix a record, they needed to verify their identity. To verify their identity, they needed to produce documentation, and the documentation they produced was then compared against the record that contained the error, a record that the institution, in many cases, treated as the authoritative source. The person standing in front of the desk, insisting that something was wrong, was not automatically trusted. The record was treated as reliable. The individual was required to prove that the record was mistaken, using a system that had already determined what the record should say. The correction process, in other words, was designed for a scenario where the record is correct and the person is confused. It was not designed well for the scenario where the record itself is the problem. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. If a system is genuinely designed to protect and accurately represent the individual, then correcting an error in that system should follow a straightforward logic. The person reports the problem. The institution investigates. The error is identified and resolved. But what a significant number of individuals have described experiencing is something that runs in the opposite direction. The system defaults to its own record. The burden of proof falls on the person outside the system, and the process for challenging the record is managed entirely by the same institution whose record is being challenged. Whether that arrangement is the result of poor design, institutional inertia, or something more deliberate is a question that has not been answered clearly. Some researchers who have examined these situations believe the problem is structural, but not intentional. Identity systems were built over decades, often by combining older paper-based records with newer digital infrastructure, and the result is a patchwork that was never comprehensively designed for the kind of correction and transparency that would serve individuals well. Errors in these systems are hard to fix not because anyone wants them to be hard to fix, but because the systems themselves were not built with that priority in mind. Complexity accumulated. Accountability did not keep pace. Others look at the same evidence and reach a different conclusion. They point to the language of the forms themselves, the breadth of what they authorize, the narrowness of what they clearly disclose, the technical precision of terms that protect the institution while leaving the individual with limited recourse. They argue that these patterns are not accidental, that the difficulty individuals face when trying to correct their records is not a byproduct of complexity, but a feature of how the process was designed, that the form is not a neutral instrument, but one that carries built-in advantages for the institution that created it. Neither explanation is complete. Neither fully accounts for every case. And the fact that two reasonably supported interpretations can sit side by side without resolving into one clear answer is itself something worth noting. When an investigation produces competing explanations that each hold partial weight, it usually means that the full picture has not yet been found. What is clear is that identity, in the practical sense, the version of you that exists in records, databases, and connected institutional systems, is more fragile than most people assume. It can shift. It can drift. It can be altered by a document you do not remember signing. And the process of restoring it, of bringing the record back into line with the reality, can be slow, complicated, and in some cases genuinely difficult to complete. The form that starts all of this looks exactly like every other form. It carries no visible mark that sets it apart. It sits on the same counter, is presented in the same tone, and is collected back with the same efficiency as any other piece of routine paperwork. There is nothing at the moment of signing that signals, "Pay attention here." This one connects further than it appears. This one may matter in ways you will not see for some time. The person behind the counter does not mention it. There is no pause. The form is received, a copy is sometimes offered, and the interaction moves on. Whatever has just been set in motion is invisible at the point of origin. It becomes visible, if it becomes visible at all, only later, when something in the record no longer matches what the person knows to be true about themselves. You sign. You move on. You forget. And somewhere, in a record you cannot access and may never think to check, something begins to quietly change. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, in the way that quiet changes tend to work, accumulating slowly, becoming visible only when enough of them have gathered in the same place. That is the question this investigation is going to follow, not toward a final answer, because the evidence, examined carefully, does not yet support one, but toward a clearer understanding of what is actually happening, of where the official explanation falls short, and of why the gap between what people are told these systems do and what people actually experience within them has remained open for as long as it has. The deeper we look, the less certain things become, and that uncertainty, rather than being the end of the inquiry, turns out to be exactly where it needs to go. Every system has an official version of itself, a description of how it works, what it is for, and why it can be trusted. Identity systems are no different, and the official version of how identity-related forms work is, on the surface, a reasonable and coherent one. According to that official version, the process is straightforward. A person needs to interact with an institution, a bank, a hospital, a government office, an employer. To do that, The institution needs to verify who the person is. A form is used to collect the necessary information. That information is stored in a secure system. It is used for the specific purpose it was collected for, and access to it is controlled, limited to those with a legitimate reason to see it. When the process is described this way, it sounds orderly. It sounds fair. It sounds like a system that was designed with the individual in mind. The language used in official descriptions of identity systems tends to be calm and procedural. Words like securely, accurately, and appropriately appear often. The tone is one of careful management, of a process designed and maintained by professionals who understand their responsibilities. And for someone reading this kind of description for the first time, without a specific reason to question it, it reads as exactly what it claims to be, a reliable account of a system that works. And in many respects, that description is accurate. Identity-related forms do serve a real and necessary function. Before standardized documents existed, verifying identity was a local and informal matter, something handled through personal recognition, community knowledge, or the word of someone trusted, that worked in small, stable communities. It did not work as populations grew, as institutions became larger, and as people began moving across regions and borders in ways that made personal recognition impossible. Something more systematic was needed. The form, the standardized document, was the answer that emerged. And for the purposes it was originally designed to serve, it was a reasonable solution. It is worth pausing here for a moment, because this history matters. The form did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a genuine administrative need, in response to a genuine problem. And that origin gives it a kind of built-in legitimacy. When an institution presents you with a form, it is not doing something arbitrary. It is operating within a long-established practice, one that most people have implicitly accepted as a reasonable part of how modern life is organized. That acceptance is real, and it is part of what makes examining the system more closely feel slightly uncomfortable. Because questioning the form means questioning something that was, at its origin, a practical and sensible solution to a real problem. The official framework that has grown around these documents reflects that origin. Laws governing data protection exist in some form in most developed countries, and many developing ones. These laws specify what information can be collected, how it must be stored, how long it can be kept, and who is permitted to access it. They require institutions to obtain consent before collecting personal data. They give individuals certain rights. In many jurisdictions, the right to know what information is held about them, the right to request corrections, and in some cases the right to request deletion. On paper, the framework is substantial. It represents decades of legislative work, informed by genuine concerns about privacy, accuracy, and the misuse of personal information. This is the version of the system that appears in government publications, in institutional policy documents, in consumer rights guidance, and in the communications that institutions send to the people whose information they hold. It is the version presented during public consultations, cited in legal proceedings, and referenced in training materials given to staff who handle personal data every day. It is, in the most literal sense, the complete official explanation, and it is not presented as a partial account. It is presented as the complete one. At first, that seems entirely reasonable. The description is consistent. The logic is clear. The institutions responsible for maintaining these systems are identifiable, regulated, and in most cases publicly accountable. But there's a problem. The gap between a system as it is described and a system as it actually functions is not unique to identity management. It appears in almost every complex institutional structure. Rules exist, processes are defined, and then real-world conditions, volume, pressure, competing priorities, human error, and the limits of enforcement shape what actually happens in practice. The question worth asking is not whether such a gap exists in identity systems. It almost certainly does. The question is how wide that gap is and what falls into it. Regulatory frameworks are written in general terms. They have to be. A law that attempted to specify every possible scenario involving personal data would be impossibly long and almost immediately outdated. So laws are written to establish principles like fairness, transparency, and proportionality. The application of those principles to specific situations is then left to interpretation. And interpretation, particularly in institutional contexts, tends to be shaped by the interests of the interpreter. An institution interpreting a data protection principle will not always reach the same conclusion as an individual trying to apply that same principle to their own situation. Both readings may be technically valid. They may arrive at very different outcomes. Consent is a useful example of this, because it sits at the center of the official framework's claim to protect individuals. The consent requirement, the rule that institutions must obtain a person's agreement before collecting or using their personal data, is one of the central pillars of most identity protection frameworks. It is meant to ensure that individuals retain some control over their own information, but the form that consent takes in practice raises questions that the framework does not fully resolve. A consent notice buried in the 14th paragraph of a document that most people will not read is technically a consent notice. It satisfies the formal requirement. Whether it satisfies the spirit of the requirement, whether it genuinely informs the person and gives them a meaningful choice, is a different question, and it is one that the official framework struggles to answer cleanly. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the official account of how consent works and the actual experience of giving consent in most institutional settings are not the same thing. The official account describes an orderly exchange of information between two parties who each understand what is being agreed to. The reality tends to look different. The official account describes an informed individual making a deliberate decision. The actual experience, for most people, is something much closer to a requirement that must be met before the service can proceed. Consent, in this context, is less a genuine choice and more a formality. And a formality is not quite the same as a safeguard. The storage of personal information is another area where the official account and the practical reality are worth examining separately. Official policy states that information is stored securely. In many cases, that is true. Institutions invest in security systems, and data breaches, while they do occur, are not the norm. But secure storage is only one part of the question. The other part is, what is the information used for, and by whom, and for how long? Official policies typically state that information is used only for the purpose for which it was collected. But institutions change. Policies change. Ownership changes. A company that collected your personal data a decade ago under one privacy policy may have been acquired, restructured, or revised its terms in ways that alter how that data is now being used. The information did not disappear. The context around it did. There's also the question of what it means for information to be used only for its intended purpose. Intentions are defined at the time of writing, but institutional needs evolve. Data that was collected for one reason often proves useful for another, and when it does, the justification for that secondary use is frequently found in the original consent document, in a clause broad enough to cover uses that were never specifically explained to the person who signed. This is not necessarily illegal. In many cases, it is specifically permitted by the framework, but it raises a question about what the framework is actually protecting, and for whose benefit it was primarily designed. Consumer protection bodies exist to bridge the gap between the framework and the individual. They receive complaints, conduct investigations, and in some cases impose penalties on institutions that violate data protection rules. Their existence is an acknowledgement that the rules alone are not enough, that enforcement is necessary, and that individuals need somewhere to turn when they believe the system has not worked as it should. That is a meaningful function, but the scale at which these bodies operate, compared to the scale of the identity system they are meant to oversee, is worth considering. The number of personal records held across all institutions in any given country runs into the hundreds of millions. The resources available to regulatory bodies are finite and, in most cases, considerably smaller than the task would seem to require. There is also a time dimension worth considering. Data protection laws are updated, but not continuously. They are written at particular moments, in response to particular concerns, and they tend to lag behind the pace at which technology and institutional practice actually move. A law passed 10 years ago was written with the technology and practices of that time in mind. The systems that now handle personal data are considerably more complex, more interconnected, and more capable than anything the drafters of that law were looking at when they wrote it. The principles may still apply, but the practical guidance those principles can offer in specific modern situations is sometimes thinner than the framework's confident language would suggest. Institutions, for their part, generally maintain that they comply with the relevant laws and that their use of personal data is appropriate and proportionate. Most of them are probably correct in that assessment, at least in a narrow legal sense. But legal compliance and genuine transparency are not identical. A practice can be technically permitted and still not be what most people would consider fair or clear if they understood exactly what was being permitted. The official explanation is not necessarily dishonest, but it is constructed from the perspective of the institution, using the language of the institution, and evaluated primarily by the standards the institution helped to shape. That is not an accusation. It is a structural observation, and it is one that matters when trying to understand why the official explanation, which sounds coherent and complete when read in isolation, sometimes fails to account for the experiences of individuals who have tried to use it as a guide to what will actually happen to their information. There is one more element of the official explanation worth examining, because it tends to be overlooked in broader discussions about identity and personal data. That element is the way the official account treats the individual. In the official version of the system, the individual is a participant who is informed, who consents, who has recourse when things go wrong, and who ultimately retains some measure of control over their own information. That framing positions the person as an active agent within the system, someone with rights that can be exercised, not simply a subject that the system acts upon. But the experience of trying to exercise those rights tells a different story in many cases. The right to access your own records exists in principle, but navigating the process of actually obtaining them often requires knowing which department to contact, which form to use, what language to use in the request, and how to follow up if the response is delayed or incomplete. The right to request a correction exists, but as discussed, the correction process frequently places the burden of proof on the individual rather than on the institution whose record contains the error. Rights that exist in principle but require significant effort, knowledge, and persistence to exercise in practice are not quite the same as rights that are genuinely accessible, and the official explanation rarely addresses that distinction directly. Some people trust the official account completely. They believe the framework is adequate, that the institutions within it operate in good faith, and that the cases where things go wrong are genuine exceptions rather than symptoms of a deeper problem. Others are less certain. They point to patterns in how personal data is managed, in how correction requests are handled, and how consent is obtained, and argue that the distance between the official description and the lived experience is too consistent to be explained entirely by individual failures. Neither position is unreasonable. Both can be supported with evidence drawn from the same system, and the fact that both exist, that the official explanation generates enough doubt to sustain a genuine disagreement about whether it is accurate, is itself significant. A framework that clearly and consistently delivered what it promised would not leave much room for that disagreement. The doubt would not have anywhere to take root. And yet here it is, present, documented, and not easily dismissed by pointing to the framework that was supposed to prevent it. The official explanation of how identity-related forms work is not a fabrication. It is a description of how the system is intended to function. But intention and function are not the same thing, and the distance between them is rarely neutral. It tends to favor someone. Understanding who it favors and who it does not is one of the questions this investigation keeps returning to. And this is where the accepted explanation begins to show its edges. Not because it is entirely wrong, but because it is incomplete. Because it describes a version of the system that is cleaner and more protective than the version many individuals have encountered. And because the gap between those two versions, the official one and the experienced one, is where the more interesting and more difficult questions live. That gap is not small. It has not been satisfactorily or clearly explained, and it does not appear to be closing on its own. There is a word that appears in almost every document designed to protect personal identity. It appears in privacy policies, in data sharing agreements, in healthcare registration forms, in financial contracts, and in the terms attached to digital services. That word is consent, and on the surface, it sounds like exactly the kind of protection a person would want. You are asked. You agree. And only then does the process continue. That framing makes consent sound like a gate, something that stands between an institution and your personal information, and that only opens when you decide to open it. The individual holds the key. Nothing passes through without permission. And for someone encountering the word in a legal context for the first time, it carries real weight. The weight of an agreement that was chosen, understood, and deliberately given. But the way consent actually functions in practice is considerably more complicated than that image suggests. And examining it closely is one of the most direct ways to understand where the official explanation of identity protection begins to show its limitations. The first thing worth noting is how frequently the word appears. Consent is not a rare concept in modern legal documentation. It is everywhere. Most people encounter some version of a consent notice or a consent checkbox multiple times in a single week. When downloading an application, when registering with a new service, when visiting a healthcare provider, when updating a financial account. The frequency of consent requests has grown significantly in recent years, partly as a result of data protection laws that made obtaining consent a formal requirement. More forms now ask for consent than ever before. In some sectors, the volume of consent-related documentation has multiplied several times over within a single decade. But that increase in the number of consent requests has not necessarily been accompanied by an increase in the quality of consent being given. If anything, the relationship may run in the opposite direction. The more routine consent requests become, the less carefully any individual request is examined. Here is where the problem becomes visible. Consent, as a legal concept, requires that the person giving it has been adequately informed. They need to understand what they are agreeing to, what the consequences are, and what alternatives exist if they choose not to agree. That is the standard the framework sets. But the standard the framework sets and the standard the framework consistently enforces are not always the same. A consent request can be technically valid. It can use the right language, appear in the right place in a document, and be accompanied by a checkbox, without genuinely informing the person who reads it. The form is satisfied. The substance is not. There is also the question of what informed actually means in this context. Most consent documents do not explain the consequences of agreeing in plain terms. They describe the permission being granted. Your data may be shared with affiliated partners. Your information may be used for research purposes, but they do not translate those permissions into concrete outcomes. What does it mean for your data to be shared with affiliated partners? How many partners? Which ones? For what specific purposes? For how long? These are the questions that would make consent genuinely meaningful, but they are almost never answered in the document itself. The permission is broad. The explanation is narrow. And the person signing is left with a general sense that something has been agreed to, without a clear understanding of what that something is. Studies examining how people actually engage with consent documents have found results that are difficult to ignore. The majority of people do not read the full text of agreements before signing them. This is not a marginal finding. It is consistent across different countries, different age groups, different levels of education, and different types of documents. Some research has gone further, calculating what it would mean for a person to genuinely read every terms and conditions agreement, every privacy policy, and every consent form they encounter in the course of a normal year. The time required, according to those estimates, would run into weeks, not hours, weeks. And that is without accounting for the additional time that understanding the language would require, since many of these documents are written in legal terms that most people are not trained to interpret. At first, this sounds like a personal failing, a matter of individual attention or responsibility. But there's a problem with that interpretation. The volume of consent requests that modern life generates is not an accident. It is a product of how systems have been designed and of how legal requirements have been implemented by institutions that are simultaneously obligated to obtain consent and incentivized to make the consent process as frictionless as possible. Frictionless, in this context, tends to mean brief, and brief tends to mean that the full implications of what is being agreed to are not presented in a way that invites reflection. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the official account of consent is built on a specific image of the person giving it. That person is imagined as someone who reads the document, considers the terms, makes a decision, and then signs. The legal framework was constructed around that image, but the image does not match the reality of how consent is actually obtained in most settings. And when the foundation of a protective framework does not match the reality it is supposed to govern, questions arise about how much protection that framework is genuinely providing. The implications of this extend beyond inconvenience. Consent, when it functions as intended, gives the individual a degree of control over their own personal information. It is meant to ensure that your data is used in ways you have actively chosen to permit. But if the consent you gave was to a document you did not read, in language you did not fully understand, in a setting that did not allow time for careful consideration, then the control that consent was supposed to provide is largely theoretical. You signed, but you may not have chosen, in any meaningful sense, to permit what the document authorized. And this raises a question that the official explanation does not fully address. If consent is the foundation of identity protection, if it is the mechanism by which individuals maintain some relationship with the decisions made about their own information, and if that consent is, in most practical instances, uninformed, then what is actually protecting people? The framework points to consent, but consent, as it currently operates, points back to a gap, not a hidden gap, a visible one that has been identified by researchers, acknowledged in some regulatory reviews, and experienced directly by a significant number of people who have tried to understand what they agreed to and found the answer difficult to locate. Some believe the answer is institutional good faith. Most organizations that collect personal data, on this view, are not looking for ways to exploit the information they hold. They collect what they need, store it appropriately, and use it for legitimate purposes. The consent process, even when it is not carefully read, functions as a formal record that the interaction occurred, and most of the time, nothing problematic follows from it. The system works not because consent is always informed, but because most of the time the institutions involved act responsibly within it. That view has genuine support. It is also worth noting that in many institutional settings, the staff who collect consent forms are not meaningfully different from the individuals who sign them. A hospital receptionist processing a new patient registration is not reviewing the consent language with the patient. A bank employee opening a new account is following a standardized procedure designed to be completed efficiently. Neither person in that interaction is engaging with the consent document as a legal instrument. One is signing it, the other is filing it. The document moves through the process, and the consent it records is considered valid, because the signature is there, regardless of how either party actually engaged with the content. It is true that the majority of personal data collected through standard institutional processes is not misused in obvious or deliberate ways. Most banks do not sell your financial history to unrelated third parties. Most healthcare providers do not share your medical details beyond the purposes for which they were given. For most people, most of the time, the practical experience of having signed a consent form they did not read is that nothing visibly unusual happens afterward. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the cases where something does happen, where personal information is shared in ways the individual did not anticipate, or used for purposes that were not clearly disclosed, are not as rare as the good faith argument would suggest. There are documented instances across multiple industries and multiple countries where consent documents authorize data uses that were technically permitted by the language of the form, but that most people, if they had understood what they were signing, would not have agreed to. The information was shared with data brokers. It was used to build behavioral profiles. It was retained for significantly longer than the individual would have expected. None of this necessarily involved a deliberate decision to harm the person, but it involved outcomes that the consent framework was ostensibly designed to prevent. Others point to a structural problem that goes beyond individual cases of misuse. They argue that the consent model, as it is currently practiced, is not a genuine protection mechanism at all. It is, in their view, a legal requirement that has been absorbed into institutional processes in a way that satisfies the letter of the requirement without engaging with its purpose. The consent checkbox exists. The consent policy is published. The formal obligations are met, but the actual transfer of control to the individual, the thing consent was supposed to achieve, does not reliably follow. What follows, instead, is a documented record of a transaction that mostly protects the institution in the event of a dispute, rather than protecting the individual in the way the law intended. There is a related issue that sits just beneath the surface of most discussions about consent, and that concerns what happens when a person tries to withdraw it. Most data protection frameworks include a right to withdraw consent, to inform an institution that you no longer agree to how your information is being used, and to request that it be deleted or restricted. In principle, this is a meaningful right. In practice, exercising it is often significantly more difficult than giving consent in the first place. Giving consent usually takes a few seconds. Withdrawing it may require navigating a separate process, submitting a formal request, waiting for a response, and in some cases following up multiple times before anything changes. The asymmetry between how easy it is to give consent and how difficult it can be to take it back is not a minor technical detail. It is a structural feature of how the process has been designed, and it raises a question about whether the right to withdraw consent is genuinely accessible or whether it exists primarily on paper. Neither of these positions is complete. The good faith argument does not account for the documented cases where consent was technically given but substantively meaningless. The structural critique does not account for the many cases where the system functions adequately and personal data is handled with genuine care. Both positions find real support in the evidence, and the fact that they sit alongside each other, each partially correct and neither fully sufficient, is one of the clearest signs that the consent framework has not been resolved, only formalized. There is one detail that makes this more difficult to simply set aside. The consent model does not affect everyone equally. That detail sounds obvious once it is stated, but it is less often examined directly. People with legal training, or with professional experience in data management, or with the time and inclination to read documents carefully, navigate consent processes with considerably more awareness than those without those resources. The protections that consent is meant to provide are, in practice, more available to some people than to others, and the same system that offers meaningful protection to those who can engage with it on its own terms offers considerably less to those who cannot. This creates a significant asymmetry that the official explanation tends not to address directly. The framework treats consent as a universal standard, a mechanism that works the same way for everyone because it is applied to everyone. But a standard applied uniformly to people with very different capacities to engage with it does not produce uniform outcomes. It produces a result shaped by those differences, and those differences are not randomly distributed. It produces outcomes shaped by those differences, and the people most likely to be left in a vulnerable position by a consent model they could not meaningfully engage with are not randomly distributed across the population. This raises questions that are genuinely difficult to answer without confronting some uncomfortable aspects of how the system was designed. And for whom? Was the consent model built primarily to protect individuals? Or was it built to create a defensible record for institutions? A documented process that demonstrates compliance with the law while leaving the practical implications of that compliance largely in institutional hands? The honest answer is probably that it was built to do both, and that the balance between those two purposes has shifted over time in ways that were not always clearly announced. What is left, when these questions are examined together, is a picture of a system that functions differently from how it is officially described. Not entirely differently, not in every case, but differently enough and consistently enough that the gap between the official version of consent and the practical reality of it is hard to dismiss as a minor implementation problem. It is a structural feature of how personal identity is currently managed, and it has not yet been addressed in a way that resolves the uncertainty it creates. The deeper this is examined, the more clearly that uncertainty becomes not a side effect of the investigation, but one of its central findings. There is a question that seems simple at first, but becomes more complicated the longer it is held. How does an institution know who you are? Not in the sense of knowing your personality, your history, or your character, but in the formal, official sense. How does a government office, a bank, a hospital, or a border crossing confirm that the person standing in front of them is who they say they are? For most people alive today, the answer involves a document. A card, a certificate, a file, a record, something physical or digital that carries your name, your date of birth, and some mark of official recognition. That document feels natural now. It feels like it has always existed, but it has not. And understanding how it came to exist and what it replaced is one of the more revealing ways to begin examining what identity actually means in the modern world. For the majority of human history, identity was not something that required proof in the way we understand proof today. A person was known by their neighbors, by the people in their village or their town, by the community they were born into and lived within. If someone needed to be identified in a dispute, in a transaction, in any situation where their name or their standing mattered, the people around them could speak to who they were. A name and a face, combined with a network of people who recognized both, was sufficient. There was no central authority keeping a unified record of every person. There was no document that defined you to someone who had never met you. Identity was relational. It existed in the space between people, confirmed by shared knowledge and common recognition. That system had limits, of course. It worked in conditions of relative stability, where people did not move far and communities remained connected over long periods. But it also worked remarkably well within those conditions. Disputes about identity existed, but they were resolved through human testimony rather than through paperwork. The question, who is this person, was answered by people, not by records. And for most of recorded history, that was considered a sufficient answer. But something began to change. Slowly at first, then more rapidly. Populations started moving in larger numbers. Cities grew. Institutions expanded their reach beyond the communities they had originally served. Trade routes extended further. Armies needed to be tracked. Taxation required accounting. And as the scale of these systems increased, a problem emerged that the older model of community recognition could not solve. How do you verify the identity of a person when no one around you knows them? How does a state official in one city confirm that the traveler arriving from another region is who they claim to be? How does an institution that serves thousands of people maintain any consistent record of who those people are? The answer, developed gradually and unevenly across different cultures and different centuries, was paper. Documents. Records written down, stamped with official marks, carried by the person they described. These early forms of identity documentation were not uniform. Different institutions developed different systems, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradicting each other. A church might keep one kind of record. A guild might keep another. A tax authority might maintain a third. The person moving between these systems might be represented differently in each, but the underlying logic was the same in all of them. When direct human recognition was not available, a written record could substitute for it. Over time, these systems became more standardized. Birth registrations became formal legal requirements in many countries. During the 18th and 19th centuries, national identification systems were developed. Passports evolved from informal letters of introduction into standardized documents with defined formats. Census records became tools for tracking population movement. The form, the standardized document with specific fields that needed to be filled in, became the primary mechanism by which institutions managed and recorded the people they governed or served. And with that shift, something else changed as well. Something that is easy to overlook when looking at the history, but that becomes harder to ignore when its implications are examined more closely. The form did not simply record a person. It became, in many institutional contexts, the official version of that person. The record and the person it described were not the same thing, but they were increasingly treated as if they were. And this is where something subtle and slightly troubling begins to appear in the history. When a person walked into an institution that held a record about them, the institution often related to the record first and the person second. The document was the authoritative source. The person was, in a sense, evidence in support of the document, or, more uncomfortably, a potential source of error that the document might need to correct. This shift was not always clearly announced. It did not happen at a specific date, in a specific country, with a clear policy statement that could be pointed to and examined. It developed incrementally, as institutions built their processes around their records rather than around the people those records described. And because each individual step seemed reasonable, because maintaining consistent records was a genuinely useful thing, and because documents could be checked and verified in ways that human memory could not, The overall direction of the shift was not always visible while it was happening. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the logic of treating records as authoritative carries a consequence that is not always discussed directly. If the record is the official version of the person, then errors in the record do not simply describe a person incorrectly. They define the person incorrectly. And the person who is defined incorrectly by an official record is then placed in the unusual position of having to prove that the document is wrong, rather than the institution having to prove that it is right. The burden shifts. The record is assumed accurate. The person must demonstrate otherwise. There are many documented situations where this plays out in ways that create real difficulty. A name spelled differently across two official documents can complicate legal processes that require consistency. A date of birth recorded incorrectly in an early registration can create complications that follow a person through decades of interaction with institutions that rely on that original record. A discrepancy between a person's lived identity and the identity captured in their official documentation can raise questions in systems that are not designed to accommodate discrepancy. In all of these cases, the problem is not simply administrative. It touches something more fundamental, the question of which version of a person is considered real. Some researchers who have examined the history of identity documentation argue that this shift from identity confirmed by community to identity defined by document represents one of the more significant changes in how human beings relate to institutions. Others are more cautious, pointing out that documentation also provided protections that the community recognition model could not. Marginalized people who were unrecognized or misrepresented in their communities sometimes found that official documentation gave them rights and standing they could not otherwise access. The document in those cases was not an imposition, it was a resource, and that complicates any simple account of what the rise of identity documentation meant for the people it affected. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the same system that provided recognition and protection to some people created new vulnerabilities for others. The person whose record was accurate and consistent, and whose life fit neatly into the categories the document required, generally found the system navigable. But the person whose record contained errors, or whose identity did not map cleanly onto the fields the form provided, found themselves in a different relationship with institutions than the one the system officially described. They were, technically, represented, but the representation did not always match the reality, and the institution, in most cases, was not equipped to hold that gap open as a question. It was equipped to process the record it had. At first, it seems like a straightforward story, a practical problem. How do you verify identity at scale? Produced a practical solution, standardized documentation, and in many respects, that is accurate. But there's a problem with stopping there, because the practical solution also carried assumptions. Assumptions about what identity is, about how it can be captured in a written form, about which aspects of a person are relevant to institutions and which are not. Those assumptions were not neutral. They shaped what the documents recorded and what they left out, and what they left out was not always insignificant. The form, by its nature, has fields, fixed categories: name, date of birth, place of birth, gender, nationality. Each of these fields describes something about a person, but none of them captures everything. And the act of fitting a person into those fields, of representing them through the categories the form provides, necessarily simplifies. It takes something complex and reduces it to something that can be recorded, processed, and cross-referenced with other records. That simplification is often necessary and harmless, but it is not always harmless. And the history of identity documentation contains enough examples of harm, of people misrepresented, misdefined, or excluded by the records that were supposed to describe them, that it raises questions the official account does not fully address. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the modern identity document is not presented as a simplification. It is presented as a verification. The document does not say, here is an approximation of who this person is, within the limits of what a form can capture. It says, here is this person's identity, confirmed and certified by an authority. That framing carries authority, and authority, in institutional contexts, tends to be treated as settled, until something goes wrong and the gap between the official version and the actual reality becomes visible enough to require attention. That gap has been examined across different periods and different settings by researchers working in history, law, and the social sciences. Their findings do not tell a single story. They describe a system that has, at various times, both protected and harmed the people it was designed to serve, sometimes simultaneously, depending on who the person was and what their relationship to official institutions happened to be. What they share is a recognition that the document is not simply a neutral record. It is an artifact of a particular way of organizing knowledge about people. And that way of organizing knowledge has consequences. Some of those consequences are visible and easily traced. Others are quieter, and some are still unfolding in ways that are not yet fully understood. What remains, after tracing this history through its quieter details, is a picture that does not fully resolve. The rise of the identity document solved real problems. It also created new ones. It gave institutions tools to verify identity at scale. It also gave institutions the means to define identity in ways that individuals could not always contest. It provided protection to people who needed it. It also, in certain circumstances, produced records that became more real than the people they were supposed to describe. Whether that balance has shifted in the right direction, or whether the current relationship between a person and their official record reflects the intentions of those who designed these systems, those questions do not have simple answers. And the fact that they remain open is itself part of the story. There is a particular kind of unsettling experience that does not involve anything dramatic. No sudden event, no obvious crisis. It begins quietly, often during a routine process, applying for a loan, updating a government record, registering with a new healthcare provider. A person sits down with a form or opens a digital portal and begins reviewing their information. And somewhere in that review, they encounter something that does not belong to them, an address they have never lived at, a middle name they do not have, an employment record that describes a job they never held. The details are small, but they are official. They exist in a system that is supposed to reflect reality, and they do not match the reality the person in front of the screen actually lived. This kind of discovery is not rare. That is worth stating clearly, because there's a tendency to treat record discrepancies as isolated incidents, the result of individual mistakes in otherwise reliable systems. But documented cases exist across many countries, many types of institutions, and many different categories of records. Financial records, medical histories, government identification databases, employment files. In each of these areas, there are people who have encountered official information about themselves that they did not recognize, did not provide, and cannot immediately explain. The frequency of these cases raises questions that go beyond simple administrative error. It raises questions about how these systems are built, how information moves between them, and what happens when the record diverges from the person it is supposed to describe. Some of these discrepancies have clear explanations. Data entry is a human process, and human processes produce errors. A number transposed during registration, a name entered into the wrong field, two files merged incorrectly because they shared a similar identifier. These are known failure modes in large data systems, and they are considered normal enough that most institutions have processes for correcting them. The explanation is straightforward. The error is identified, the correction is requested, the record is updated. That is how the process is supposed to work. And in many cases, it does work that way, but not always. And the cases where it does not follow that path are the ones that become more difficult to understand. There is a second category of discrepancy that is harder to account for so easily. These are cases where the incorrect information is not obviously the result of a simple mistake. The details that appear in the record are specific. They are internally consistent. They do not look like a data entry error. An address that appears in a financial record is a real address, just not one the person has any connection to. A medical detail listed in a health file is medically coherent. It just does not belong to that individual. These cases are harder to trace back to a single point of origin. And when individuals have tried to investigate where the information came from, the answers have not always been straightforward. Some individuals have reported a pattern that is worth noting. The discrepancies they encountered appeared, or became visible, after they had completed a specific interaction with an institution, a form submitted at a financial office, a registration completed at a government agency, a digital application processed through a connected system. After that interaction, something in their broader record profile looked different. Not dramatically. The change was subtle, a field that had not been there before, a detail that appeared without a clear source. At first glance, it could be dismissed. Records are updated regularly. Systems pull information from multiple sources. There are many legitimate reasons why a record might look slightly different after an institutional interaction. But the question of which specific interaction produced which specific change is not always easy to answer. And that lack of traceability is itself something worth examining. At first, it seems normal. Errors happen. Systems are imperfect. Any large database containing personal information about millions of people will contain inaccuracies. That is not a controversial claim. It is acknowledged by the institutions that maintain these systems. Audit processes exist precisely because errors are expected. Correction procedures are built into the system because it is understood that records will not always be perfectly accurate. The existence of a discrepancy, on its own, is not evidence of anything beyond the ordinary imperfection of large-scale data management. But there is a problem, and the problem appears not in the discrepancy itself, but in what happens when a person tries to fix it. The process of correcting an incorrect record is, in principle, straightforward. A person identifies the error, contacts the relevant institution, provides evidence that the information is wrong, and the record is updated. That is the official process, and it does function in many cases. But in a significant number of documented situations, the process does not proceed that simply. The person attempting to correct their record discovers that the institution requires them to verify their identity before making any changes, and the verification process relies on the same records that contain the error. The system that holds incorrect information is also the system that is used to confirm who you are, and that creates a circularity that is not easy to resolve. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the logic of the correction process assumes that the rest of the record is reliable enough to serve as a foundation for fixing one part of it. If your address is wrong but everything else matches, the institution can use the other details to confirm your identity and make the correction. But when the discrepancy is more significant, when multiple fields are affected, or when the incorrect information is embedded in records across more than one connected system, the foundation itself becomes uncertain. You are being asked to prove who you are using a system that is already describing you incorrectly, and the tools available to make that proof are the same tools that produce the problem. Some people who have navigated this process describe it as arguing with a closed system, not because the individuals they spoke to were unhelpful or deliberately obstructive. In many accounts, the staff involved were cooperative and willing to assist. The difficulty was not human. It was structural. The system was designed to treat its own records as authoritative. A correction request was, in the system's logic, a challenge to that authority. And challenges to the authority of official records require a higher level of verification than ordinary transactions. So the person seeking a correction found themselves in a position where the error in the record made it harder to meet the verification standard required to fix the error. The circle did not open easily. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because what it reveals is something about how these systems were designed and what assumptions were built into them. The default assumption is that the record is correct. The exception, the case that requires additional handling, is the person claiming the record is wrong. That design logic makes sense from a security standpoint. Systems that are easy to alter are vulnerable to manipulation. Requiring verification before making changes is a reasonable precaution. But the same precaution that protects the system against unauthorized changes also protects incorrect information from being corrected by the person it incorrectly describes. The security feature and the barrier are the same feature, approached from different directions. This raises questions about how the balance was struck when these systems were designed. Was sufficient consideration given to the situation where the record itself was the source of the problem? Were correction pathways designed with the assumption that errors would be minor and easily isolated? Or were they designed primarily with fraud prevention in mind, leaving the person with a more fundamental discrepancy without a clear route to resolution? These questions do not have published answers in most institutional documentation. The design decisions that shape these processes were made in technical and administrative contexts that are not always visible to the people who eventually have to navigate the results. But this is where it becomes unclear, because across the documented cases of record discrepancy, there's a detail that does not fully make sense within the standard administrative error explanation. In several reported situations, the same type of discrepancy appeared across multiple individuals who had no connection to each other, but who had interacted with the same institutional system within a similar time period. The specific details differed, but the nature of the discrepancy, the type of information affected, the way it appeared in the record, followed a recognizable pattern. Administrative errors are generally random. They reflect the specific mistakes of individual data entry processes. They do not tend to cluster. When a pattern appears across unconnected individuals, it invites a different kind of question, not necessarily a dramatic one, but a careful one. Some researchers who have examined these cases suggest that the explanation lies in how data is aggregated and shared between connected systems. Personal information does not always stay within the institution that originally collected it. It moves. It is matched against other records. It is enriched with additional data pulled from other sources. And in that process of movement and matching, information from one person's file can, under certain conditions, become attached to another's. Not through deliberate action, not through any kind of intent, simply through the mechanical logic of how large systems process and reconcile data. The record that ends up in front of a person may contain information that arrived there through several intermediary steps, none of which were directly visible to the person whose file was being built. Others are less certain about that explanation. They point out that the movement of data between systems is supposed to be governed by rules that prevent exactly this kind of cross-contamination. Identity matching protocols exist specifically to ensure that information is attached to the correct individual before it is transferred. If those protocols were functioning properly, the pattern of discrepancies that has been reported should be significantly less common than it appears to be. The fact that it is not less common either suggests that the protocols are not always functioning as intended, or that there are conditions under which they produce results that were not anticipated in the original design. Neither of those possibilities is fully comfortable, and this is where the investigation reaches a point where certainty becomes difficult to maintain. The documented cases are real. The pattern within those cases is real. The structural features of the correction process that make resolving these discrepancies difficult are real. What is less clear is the precise origin of the incorrect information in cases where a simple administrative error does not provide a sufficient explanation. The systems involved are large, complex, and not entirely transparent in how they process and store information. The data trails that would be needed to trace each discrepancy back to its source are not always preserved in a form that is accessible to the individual affected, or even to the institution attempting to investigate. What remains, when these details are considered together, is a picture that resists easy resolution. Record discrepancies exist. They are not always minor. They are not always simple to correct, and the process of correction, in cases where the discrepancy is significant, can place the individual in a position where the system designed to protect their identity becomes, in practice, an obstacle to restoring it. Whether that outcome reflects a design flaw, a resource limitation, or something else that has not yet been clearly identified, those questions remain open. The cases that have been documented do not provide a complete answer. They provide a direction, and that direction points toward aspects of how personal records are managed that have not yet received the level of public examination they may require. Most people, when they complete a form, think of it as a contained action. You fill in the fields. You sign at the bottom. You hand it over or submit it digitally. And then it is done. The form has been completed. The process has moved forward. Whatever the form was for, opening an account, registering with a service, applying for something, the transaction feels finished. The paper, or the digital record, has gone somewhere, and your part in it is over. That is how it feels. But that feeling does not accurately describe what actually happens to most forms after they leave the person who completed them. And the gap between how it feels and what actually occurs is worth examining carefully. When a form enters an institutional system, particularly a financial or legal one, it does not simply sit in a file and wait to be retrieved. It becomes part of a network. The information it contains is processed, matched, and often connected to other records that already exist about that person. Some of those connections happen within the same institution. Others happen across institutions that share data under agreements the individual may not be aware of. A form submitted to a bank may trigger an update in a credit reference database. A form submitted to a government office may connect to records held by other agencies. A registration completed with one service may feed information into a broader data ecosystem that includes partners, affiliated organizations, and third-party processors. Each of these connections is, in most cases, technically disclosed somewhere in the documentation that accompanied the form. But disclosed and understood are not the same thing. And that difference is where the questions begin. The network that a form enters is not always visible from the outside. It is not presented as a network. It is presented as a single transaction with a single institution for a single purpose. The form asks for your name, your address, your date of birth, your financial details, or whatever category of information it requires. It does not present a map of where that information will travel after you provide it. It does not show you the connected systems, the partner organizations, or the automatic processes that will be triggered once your data enters the system. That information exists. It is contained in the terms and conditions, in the privacy notices, in the data sharing agreements that are attached to most formal institutional interactions. But it exists in a form that is not designed to be easily read or easily understood by the person completing the transaction. This is not entirely surprising. Large institutions operate across complex regulatory environments. The legal documentation that governs how they collect, store, and share personal information must account for a wide range of scenarios, legal requirements, and jurisdictional differences. The result is documentation that is, in many cases, genuinely long and technically written. A privacy notice for a major financial institution or a large digital service can run to tens of thousands of words. It may reference other documents, which reference other documents in turn. Reading it fully and understanding it accurately is not a realistic expectation for most people completing a routine transaction. That is simply the scale of what the documentation covers. And this is where a first question arises. If the documentation cannot realistically be read and understood by the person it is addressed to, then in what sense does it constitute genuine disclosure? Some researchers who have studied identity vulnerability have focused on a specific feature of certain form structures, not simply on the fact that the terms are long and complex, that is acknowledged as a general problem in data governance, but on something more specific. They have examined cases where the language used to describe data sharing appears to have been constructed in a way that makes the scope of that sharing as difficult to grasp as possible while remaining technically accurate. The language does not say anything false, but it is organized, layered, and phrased in a way that makes its practical meaning resistant to straightforward reading. This distinction between language that is complex because the subject is complex and language that is complex in a way that serves a particular purpose is not always easy to identify. But in certain cases, researchers have argued that the distinction is visible if you look closely enough. At first, it seems like a reasonable interpretation. Legal language is specialized. Regulatory requirements are genuinely complicated. The people who write these documents are working within constraints that are not always of their own choosing. Complexity, in that context, might simply be the unavoidable result of trying to cover every required disclosure accurately. That explanation is plausible. It accounts for a significant amount of what is observed. But there is a problem, because if the complexity were simply a reflection of regulatory necessity, you would expect it to be distributed evenly across the document. You would expect the sections describing the institution's own obligations to be as complex as the sections describing the rights being granted. That is not consistently what researchers have found. In several documented analyses of institutional documentation, the sections that describe data sharing permissions, the parts that authorize the broadest transfer of personal information, are among the most densely written. The sections that describe how a person can limit or withdraw those permissions are often shorter, but positioned in ways that are less prominent and less easily located. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because documentation structure is not accidental. The placement of information within a document, the order in which sections appear, the language register used in different parts, these are design decisions. Someone chose where to put the data, sharing authorization. Someone chose the language that describes it. Someone decided how prominently to feature the opt-out process relative to the opt-in. These decisions may have been made for entirely legitimate reasons. They may reflect legal advice, regulatory guidance, or institutional precedent, rather than any deliberate intent to obscure. But they are decisions, and the pattern that emerges from examining them across multiple institutions and multiple types of documents is not random. It is consistent, and consistency, in a pattern that reliably produces a particular outcome, raises questions about whether that outcome was anticipated. But this is where it becomes unclear, because identifying a pattern is not the same as explaining it. A consistent pattern of complex disclosure language could reflect a consistent set of regulatory pressures that push institutions in the same direction regardless of intent. It could reflect the influence of shared legal templates and industry standards that spread common practices across institutions without any central coordination. It could reflect the accumulated result of many small decisions made by many different people, none of whom individually intended to produce the overall effect. Or it could reflect something more deliberate. The evidence available does not settle this question cleanly, and the researchers who have examined it most carefully tend not to claim that it does. What they point to is the pattern. What they leave open is the question of what the pattern means. There is a related feature of certain forms that has attracted specific attention. Some financial and legal forms contain language that authorizes not just the sharing of information that is provided on the form itself, but the enrichment of that information with additional data from external sources. This means that completing the form does not simply make your provided information available to the institution and its partners. It can also authorize the institution to add to your record, to pull in information from other databases, other transactions, other connected systems, and to treat that enriched record as your profile. The profile that exists in the system after you complete the form may contain significantly more information than you provided, and the authorization for that enrichment was contained in the document you signed. Whether it was understood at the point of signing is a separate question. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the enrichment of records through connected data sources is a standard feature of how many modern institutions operate. It is used for identity verification, for fraud prevention, for credit assessment, and for many other legitimate purposes. The practice is not hidden. It is disclosed. The legal basis for it exists in the documentation, but the practical effect of it, the fact that the record that now exists about you in an institutional system may draw on sources you did not directly interact with, may include information you did not provide, and may have been built through a process that was not described to you in terms you could readily understand, is not something most people are aware of when they complete a form. And there's a question about what it means to consent to a process you do not know is happening. Some believe that institutions approach this honestly and with genuine intent to inform. The documentation, on this view, does what it is supposed to do. It discloses the relevant information. If the person completing the form does not read it, that is not a failure of disclosure. It is a failure of engagement. The institution fulfilled its obligation. What happens afterward is within the terms that were provided. Others disagree. They argue that a disclosure that cannot realistically be understood by the people it is addressed to is not a meaningful disclosure, that the obligation to inform is not satisfied simply by the technical presence of information somewhere in a document. That genuine transparency requires something more than placing accurate language in a form that no one will read. Neither position fully resolves the question, and the question itself keeps returning, in different forms, across different contexts. However, the discussion does not stay at the level of abstract principle. There are documented cases where individuals have discovered, after completing a specific institutional form, that their data profile and connected systems had changed in ways they did not expect and could not directly trace. Information appeared that they had not provided. Records that had been consistent began to show variations. The timing of these changes corresponded to their completion of a particular form, but the specific mechanism that produced the changes was not easily identified. The institution, when approached, confirmed that the individual's information had been processed according to standard procedures. The standard procedures, when examined, were found to include data enrichment and third-party matching processes that had been authorized by the form. The form had been signed. The process had been followed. And yet the outcome, the altered record, had not been anticipated by the person whose record it was. These cases are not extreme. They are not presented here as evidence of deliberate harm. They are presented as examples of how a system designed around technical compliance with disclosure requirements can produce outcomes that the people it affects would not have predicted, even if they had read the documentation carefully. And that gap between what the documentation technically authorizes and what the person completing it actually understands is the central question that this area of research keeps returning to, not because the answer is obvious, but because it is not. And this is where the investigation reaches a point that is difficult to move past cleanly. The form is a document. The document is a legal instrument. The legal instrument contains disclosures. The disclosures authorize processes. The processes produce outcomes. Each step in that chain is, technically, defensible. Each step can be pointed to as a legitimate part of a system designed to operate within established rules. But when the chain is followed from beginning to end, from the person sitting down to complete what feels like a routine transaction to the record that exists about them afterward, the distance between those 2 points is sometimes larger than it appears. And the question of whether that distance was designed, or whether it simply accumulated, remains one that the available evidence has not yet fully answered. What stays open, at the end of examining these details, is something that resists being closed. The forms move through systems. The systems connect to other systems. The data travels along routes that were disclosed, but not described in a way that made them visible. And the record that emerges at the other end of that process belongs, officially, to the person whose name is on it. But the process that built it was not one they fully witnessed. Whether that is a problem to be corrected, or simply a feature of how modern institutional data management works, is a question that different people answer differently. And the fact that the answer is not settled, that it continues to be examined, disputed, and returned to, is itself part of what makes the question worth continuing to ask. There is a particular kind of evidence that is difficult to dismiss, not because it is dramatic, but because it keeps appearing. A single case can be explained. 2 cases can be coincidence. But when the same basic structure repeats across different countries, different institutions, different types of records, and different categories of people, when the shape of the problem is recognizable even when the specific details change, then the explanation of coincidence begins to lose its footing. And that is precisely the situation that researchers examining identity vulnerability have found themselves in when they look at this area carefully. Not one pattern, not 2, a pattern that recurs. And recurrence, in research, means something. The pattern itself is not complicated to describe. A person completes a form. It could be a financial form, a legal document, a government registration, a healthcare record, or any one of the many formal documents that modern institutional life requires. The form is submitted. The process moves forward. Life continues. And then, at some point afterward, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months, sometimes significantly longer, something changes. Not dramatically, in most cases. Quietly. The person applies for something and is told their profile does not match what they expected. Or they review a record and find information that does not reflect their history. Or a system they have used reliably begins producing results that do not correspond to what they know about themselves. The change is noticed, and when they begin to look for its source, the trail often leads back to a document they signed. Sometimes the connection is clear and traceable. Often it is not. What makes this pattern worth examining is not any single case within it. Individual cases of record discrepancy, as already noted, are not unusual. Large data systems produce errors. Institutions correct them. That is the normal cycle. What is worth examining is the consistency of the structure across cases that have no obvious connection to each other. A person in one country, dealing with a financial institution, traces a change in their credit profile back to a form they completed during a routine account update. A person in a different country, dealing with a government agency, traces an eligibility change back to a registration document. A third person, in a different context entirely, finds that their medical record contains information that appeared after a specific institutional interaction. The details are different. The institutions are different. The countries are different, but the shape is the same. Form completed. Time passed. Record changed. Source unclear. Independent consumer advocacy organizations in several countries have been collecting cases with this structure for a number of years. Their documentation is not uniform. Different organizations use different methodologies, focus on different sectors, and draw different conclusions from what they find. But the cases they have documented share enough structural features that researchers who have examined them across contexts have noted the resemblance. The resemblance is not proof of anything specific. It does not establish that the cases are connected or that they result from the same underlying cause, but it does establish that the pattern is real. It exists in the documented record, and its existence raises questions that the standard explanation, administrative error, isolated incident, routine system imperfection, does not fully address. The standard explanation is worth taking seriously because it accounts for a genuine portion of what is observed. Large data systems do produce errors. Those errors are sometimes clustered. If a particular process or system component is functioning incorrectly, it may affect multiple records in similar ways before the problem is identified and corrected. A cluster of similar errors does not necessarily indicate anything beyond a shared technical failure, and many of the cases that follow the pattern described here may, in fact, have exactly that kind of explanation. A broken process, a misconfigured system, an error that propagated across connected records before anyone noticed. That is a plausible and in many ways unsatisfying explanation, because it is the kind of explanation that does not produce a clear responsible party or a clear resolution. But it is plausible. However, the timeline does not fully match in all cases, because administrative errors, when they are the result of a broken process, tend to be identified and corrected within the normal cycle of system auditing. They are found. They are fixed. The cluster of similar errors closes. But the pattern of cases being described here does not consistently follow that cycle. In a number of documented situations, the change in a person's record persisted after the individual reported it. Correction requests were submitted. In some cases, partial corrections were made, but the underlying source of the discrepancy was not always identified, and in some cases the same type of discrepancy reappeared after the initial correction. That does not fit the profile of a simple administrative error that was caught and resolved. It fits the profile of something that is either recurring or that was not fully identified in the first place. This is where the concept that some researchers call the chain effect becomes relevant. The term describes a specific feature of how interconnected record systems behave when information changes at one point in the network. When a record is updated in one system, that update can trigger automatic updates in connected systems that share data with the first. This is a standard feature of integrated data architecture. It is how systems stay synchronized. If your address changes in one record, the change may propagate to other records that draw from the same source. That is the intended function. But the chain effect, as researchers have used the term, refers to what happens when an error or an unintended alteration enters at one point in the chain. The alteration does not stay in the system where it originated. It travels. It propagates to connected records, following the same pathways that legitimate updates use. And by the time the person whose record was affected notices something is wrong, the alteration may already exist in multiple systems, each of which obtained it from another system, and none of which is clearly the original source. At first, it seems like a technical problem with a technical solution. Map the connections. Find the origin point, correct the record there, and the correction will propagate in the same way the error did. But there is a problem. The connections between data systems are not always fully documented in a way that is accessible to the individual whose record is affected, or even to the frontline staff at the institution they contact for help. The architecture of large institutional data systems is complex, and the specific pathways along which information travels are not always visible from the outside. An individual trying to trace a record discrepancy back to its source may be able to identify that something changed, and approximately when, but not the specific mechanism that produced the change or the specific point in the chain where the alteration entered. And without that information, correcting the record in a way that addresses the actual source, rather than simply patching the visible symptom, is significantly more difficult. Some researchers describe this as a visibility problem. The data systems that hold personal records are, in many cases, not designed to be transparent to the people whose information they contain. They are designed to be functional, to store, process, and share information efficiently within and between institutions. Transparency to the individual is a secondary consideration, addressed through disclosure documentation and access rights rather than through the design of the system itself. The result is that the person whose identity is held within these systems has, in practice, limited ability to see how their information is being processed, where it is traveling, and what is happening to it at each step. They can request access to their own records. They can submit correction requests, but they cannot directly observe the network their information inhabits. And that asymmetry between what the system knows about the person and what the person can know about the system is a structural feature, not an accidental one. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because visibility is not a peripheral feature of identity protection. It is central to it. The right to know what information is held about you, and to correct it when it is wrong, is considered one of the foundational elements of data rights in most modern legal frameworks. But a right that can only be exercised at the surface level, that allows you to see certain records and request certain corrections, without giving you access to the underlying processes that produce those records, is a right that operates within significant constraints. You can see the output. You cannot always see how the output was generated. And when the output is wrong, not being able to see how it was generated makes the process of correcting it considerably harder. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the researchers who have examined the chain effect and its consequences are not in agreement about what it means. Some argue that the pattern of recurring discrepancies, spread across connected systems and resistant to straightforward correction, reflects a genuine structural flaw in how identity records are managed. The systems were not designed with sufficient attention to what happens when an error enters the network. The correction mechanisms were not built to match the scale and complexity of the propagation mechanisms. The result is a system that is very efficient at spreading information, including incorrect information, and considerably less efficient at withdrawing it once it has spread. That is a design problem. And design problems, on this view, require design solutions. Others are more cautious. They point out that the cases documenting this pattern, while real and significant, represent a fraction of the total volume of institutional data processing that occurs. For the vast majority of people, most of the time, their records remain accurate, their institutional interactions proceed normally, and the chain of connected systems functions as intended, updating records correctly and providing reliable information to the institutions that rely on it. The existence of a pattern of discrepancies does not mean the system is fundamentally broken. It means the system has failure modes. Every large system has failure modes. The relevant question is whether those failure modes are being adequately identified and addressed. And on that question, the evidence is genuinely mixed. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because both of those positions find real support in the documented record. The pattern of discrepancies is real and structurally consistent enough to raise questions that the administrative error explanation does not fully answer. The system also functions adequately for a significant majority of people a significant majority of the time. These two observations do not cancel each other out. They sit alongside each other, and the tension between them is not easily resolved by pointing to one and dismissing the other. What is perhaps most significant about the pattern is not any single feature of it, but the fact that it has been independently identified, in different contexts, by people who were not looking for the same thing and did not start from the same assumptions. Consumer advocates documenting individual cases of record discrepancy. researchers studying the architecture of interconnected data systems, legal analysts examining the mechanisms through which correction rights are exercised in practice. They came to the subject from different directions. They used different methods, and they arrived at observations that, when placed alongside each other, describe the same basic shape. That convergence does not prove a specific cause, but it does suggest that what is being described is a real feature of a landscape, and not simply an artifact of any one researcher's perspective or methodology. What remains, after following the pattern through these different contexts and different observations, is a question that the available evidence raises, but does not settle. If the same structure keeps appearing, form completed, time passed, record changed, source unclear, and if that structure has been documented independently across different countries and different institutional settings, then the explanation that each instance is simply a random and isolated error becomes harder to hold on to. Not because the alternative is clearly established, but because the pattern itself requires an explanation, and the explanations currently on offer, whether they point to technical failure, design limitation, or something else, have not yet been examined at a scale or with a rigor that would allow any one of them to be confidently accepted or confidently set aside. That examination has not yet fully occurred, and its absence is itself something worth noting. Most discussions about identity protection are framed around the individual. One person, one record, one set of details that either accurately reflects who that person is or does not. The conversation tends to stay at that level. What information is held, whether it is correct, what rights the individual has to access and correct it. That framing is understandable. Identity is, in its most basic sense, something that belongs to a person, and the problems that arise when identity records go wrong are experienced, at the most immediate level, by the person whose record is affected. But that framing is also incomplete, because the effects of a record discrepancy do not always stay contained within the life of the individual it directly concerns. They move outward, and the ways in which they move outward are not always visible until the damage has already accumulated. The connection between one person's identity record and the records of people around them is not always obvious, but it is real. Family relationships are one of the clearest examples. In many legal and institutional systems, records are linked across family members in ways that reflect shared legal status, shared financial history, or shared documentation. A parent's records connect to a child's. Spouses share financial and legal documentation that references both of them. Siblings may appear in the same inheritance documents, the same property records, the same administrative filings. These connections exist because the legal systems that manage identity and status recognize that people do not exist in isolation. Their legal identity is embedded in relationships, and when one person's record shifts, even slightly, even incorrectly, those connections mean that the shift does not stay isolated. It can reach the records of other people through the same pathways that link them in normal circumstances. Consider what this means in practice. A parent's name is recorded slightly differently across two connected systems. That discrepancy may seem minor in isolation, but if that parent's record is referenced in a property document, in a will, or in a child citizenship or inheritance filing, the discrepancy can create complications that affect not just the parent but everyone whose legal status depends on the accuracy of that record. A child's right to inherit, a spouse's access to shared financial accounts, a business partner's ability to complete a transaction that references the shared documentation. None of these people made a mistake. None of them submitted a form with incorrect information, but they are affected by a discrepancy in someone else's record because their own records are connected to it, and that connection, in most cases, is not something they can easily see or easily manage. This is where the problem begins to expand beyond the individual case in a way that is difficult to fully account for, because the standard framework for identity protection is built around individual rights. The right to access your own records, the right to correct errors in your own files, the right to be informed about how your own information is being used. These rights are real and important, but they address the individual dimension of the problem. They do not directly address what happens when one person's record error creates downstream complications for people who had no involvement in the original transaction. Those people have their own rights, of course. They can make their own correction requests, pursue their own access rights, navigate their own institutional interactions. But they are dealing with the consequences of something that happened in someone else's record, something they may not even know occurred until they encounter a problem that leads them back to it. At first, it seems like this would be a recognizable and trackable kind of problem. If record discrepancies spread through family and legal connections, then the cases involving multiple affected parties should be visible as a cluster. One person's record is wrong. Connected records are also affected. The cluster is identified. The source is traced. The corrections are made. But there is a problem. The connections between records are not always transparent, even to the institutions that hold them. A financial institution may hold a record that references a person's name and date of birth, and may share that record with connected systems, without having a complete picture of which other records depend on that information being accurate. The network of dependencies is often larger than any single institution can see from its own position within it, and that means the cluster, even when it exists, is not always visible as a cluster. It appears as separate, unconnected problems in separate systems, each one looking like an isolated discrepancy, none of them obviously connected to the others. But this is where it becomes unclear, because if the connections between records are not fully visible to the institutions that hold them, then the question of how to identify and correct record errors that have propagated through those connections does not have a straightforward answer. The correction process, as it currently operates, is largely individual and sequential. One person identifies an error. One correction request is submitted. One institution reviews it. That process is not designed to follow an error through a network of connected records and correct it everywhere it has traveled. It is designed to address the specific record that the specific individual has identified as wrong. And that is a significant limitation when the problem is not confined to a single record. There is a related dimension that researchers studying large-scale data incidents have identified, and that receives considerably less attention than it perhaps deserves. When people think about serious identity-related data incidents, they tend to think of the high-profile events, the large breaches where millions of records are accessed without authorization, where passwords and financial details are exposed. These events generate significant coverage because they are visible and because their scale is immediately apparent. But researchers who have examined the landscape of identity-related harm more broadly have noted something that complicates that picture. The most damaging incidents are not always the most visible ones, and the category of incident that tends to produce sustained, difficult-to-resolve harm is not theft. It is alteration. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Stolen data, in many cases, can eventually be detected. Patterns of unauthorized use can trigger alerts. Account activity can be monitored. Fraud detection systems are specifically designed to identify the kinds of transactions that typically follow data theft. None of these detection mechanisms are perfect, but they are oriented toward the problem. Altered data is different. When information in a record is changed, when a detail is subtly modified rather than removed or exposed, the alteration may not trigger any alert. It looks, to the systems that process it, like updated information. It has the same formal status as a legitimate record change. The systems that rely on it treat it as accurate because nothing in the structure of the information signals that it is not. And the person whose record was altered may not discover the change until they encounter a situation where the incorrect information causes a problem, which may be months or years after the alteration occurred. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the gap between when an alteration occurs and when it is discovered is not a gap that exists only in theory. It has been documented. There are cases where individuals have traced a record discrepancy back to a point of origin that was significantly earlier than they expected, where the incorrect information had existed in their record for an extended period before they became aware of it, because nothing in their daily interactions with institutional systems had made the discrepancy visible. The record was wrong. The systems were processing it as correct. Life continued, and the accumulation of decisions made on the basis of the incorrect record continued along with it. By the time the problem became apparent, it was embedded in a history of transactions, assessments, and institutional decisions that had all proceeded from the flawed foundation. Some researchers describe this as the accumulation problem, not a single error with a single consequence, but a series of downstream effects that build over time on the basis of an incorrect record. Each effect is individually small. Each transaction or assessment that relied on the wrong information seemed, at the time, routine. But the cumulative result, once visible, is significantly harder to unwind than a single isolated error would be, because unwinding it requires not just correcting the original record, but identifying every decision that was made on the basis of the incorrect version, and determining which of those decisions needs to be revisited. That is, in most institutional contexts, an extremely difficult undertaking. The systems involved may not retain the full history of how the incorrect information influenced their outputs. The decisions may have been made by multiple institutions, none of which has a complete picture of the other's involvement, and the person seeking resolution is left trying to reconstruct a chain of causation across systems that were not designed to make that reconstruction easy. However, the timeline does not fully match when the accumulation problem is described at the level of individual cases alone, because the researchers who have identified this pattern argue that its significance goes beyond any single person's experience of it. They point to the collective dimension. If record alterations propagate through connected systems, and if the effects of those alterations accumulate over time before they are detected, then the total impact across a population of affected individuals may be considerably larger than the number of reported cases suggests. Most people who are affected by a subtle record discrepancy do not report it to a consumer advocacy organization or a research body. They deal with the immediate problem as best they can. They correct what they can correct. They navigate what they cannot, and they move on. The case does not enter any dataset. The pattern it belongs to is not visible from any single institutional vantage point. What remains in the documented record is a fraction of what actually occurred. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the difference between the documented scale of a problem and its actual scale is not a peripheral detail. It is directly relevant to how the problem is assessed, how resources are allocated to address it, and what level of urgency it receives from institutions and regulators. A problem that appears in a relatively small number of documented cases can be addressed as a manageable edge case. A problem that affects a significantly larger population, but whose full extent is invisible because most cases go unreported, is a different kind of problem. It requires different responses, and the question of which description is accurate, contained, and manageable, or larger than the visible evidence suggests, is not one that the currently available data can fully answer. Some believe that the documented cases, while genuinely significant, represent an accurate enough picture of the problem's scale that the existing response mechanisms are broadly adequate. Errors occur, corrections are available, and the majority of affected individuals are able to resolve their situations through existing processes. On this view, the problem is real but proportionate, a set of challenges within a system that functions adequately for most people most of the time. Others look at the same evidence and reach a different conclusion. They argue that a system in which the full scale of the problem is not visible, in which the most damaging incidents are precisely the ones least likely to be detected and reported, cannot be confidently described as broadly adequate. The absence of visible harm is not the same as the absence of harm. And in a system where altered records can accumulate consequences silently over extended periods, the absence of visible harm may simply reflect how the system was designed, rather than how it is actually performing. And this is where the investigation reaches a point where the available evidence and the questions it generates are not easily brought into alignment. The individual cases are documented. The structural features that allow discrepancies to propagate, accumulate, and remain undetected are identifiable. The collective dimension, the question of how many people are affected in ways that have not been captured in any dataset, remains genuinely open. The connections between individual records and the records of people around them are real and consequential. The mechanisms for addressing problems that cross those connections are limited. None of these observations, taken individually, constitutes a complete account of the problem, but together, they describe something that is larger than any single case suggests. And that larger shape, the scale of what may be happening, across systems and across time, in ways that are not fully visible from any single vantage point, is what makes this dimension of the problem the most difficult to bring into focus, and perhaps the most important to try. There is a particular kind of problem that resists simple explanation, not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence points in more than one direction. Multiple interpretations exist. Each of them finds genuine support in what has been documented, and none of them fully accounts for everything that has been observed. This is not the kind of problem where more research will eventually narrow the field down to one clear answer that everyone accepts. It is the kind of problem where the competing explanations each illuminate something real, and where the difficulty lies in understanding how those different things relate to each other. The question of what is happening with identity records, institutional forms, and the systems that connect them is, at this point in the investigation, exactly that kind of problem. Before examining the different interpretations, it is worth pausing on what they are trying to explain. The pattern that has been documented across different countries, different institutions, and different categories of records involves a consistent structure. People complete forms. Records change. Discrepancies appear. Corrections are difficult. Effects propagate. And the full scale of what is happening remains, by most assessments, only partially visible. That is what the interpretations are attempting to account for. Not a single dramatic event. Not a clear villain or a clear victim. A persistent, structural pattern with real consequences that has resisted simple explanation despite being examined by researchers, consumer advocates, legal analysts, and regulatory bodies across multiple jurisdictions. The fact that no single explanation has emerged as dominant is itself part of what needs to be understood. The first interpretation, and perhaps the most widely held among researchers who study data systems, focuses on structure rather than intent. On this view, what is being observed is not the result of any deliberate design. It is the result of systems that were built in different eras, for different purposes, using different standards, and that have been connected to each other over time in ways that were not fully planned or coordinated. The identity infrastructure that exists today was not designed as a unified system. It grew. Different institutions built their own databases. Different governments developed their own identification frameworks. Different sectors created their own standards for what information to collect, how to store it, and how to share it. And as digital technology made it possible to connect these systems, they were connected, often because the connections were useful and sometimes because they were required, without the kind of comprehensive architectural planning that would have been needed to ensure the whole network functioned reliably. The result on this interpretation is not conspiracy. It is systemic fragility, a network of systems that were not originally designed to work together, that use different data formats and different identity matching protocols, and that interact in ways that were not fully anticipated when the connections were made. Errors enter at the points where these systems meet and exchange information. Data that was accurate in one system's format becomes slightly distorted when transferred to another. Matching processes that are supposed to ensure information is attached to the correct individual sometimes attach it incorrectly, because the identifiers used by the two systems do not map perfectly onto each other. None of this requires any bad faith. It requires only complexity. And the complexity of modern identity infrastructure is, by most technical assessments, very high. That explanation has genuine force. It accounts for a significant portion of the documented pattern. Large, complex systems do behave in exactly these ways. Interoperability failures are a known and studied problem in data architecture. The structural fragility interpretation is not speculative. It is grounded in a well-established understanding of how large data systems behave when they are connected without sufficient coordination. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the structural fragility explanation, while compelling, does not fully account for all of the features of the pattern. Specifically, it does not account for the features of certain form designs that researchers have identified. The consistent placement of broad data, sharing permissions in the most difficult sections to read, the asymmetry between how easy it is to give consent and how difficult it is to withdraw it, the specific ways in which correction processes are structured that make them harder to use in exactly the cases where they are most needed. These features do not look like the random output of a fragile system. They look like decisions. The second interpretation takes that observation as its starting point. It focuses not on technical fragility, but on institutional incentives. The argument, made by several analysts and researchers, who approach the problem from an economic and organizational perspective, is this: personal data has become extraordinarily valuable. It is used for credit assessment, for insurance pricing, for targeted marketing, for behavioral profiling, for risk modeling across a wide range of sectors. The institutions that collect personal information through forms and registrations are not simply gathering data they need for their stated purposes. They are building assets, and assets, from an institutional perspective, are worth protecting and maximizing. The design of the forms through which that data is collected, and the terms under which it is shared, reflects, on this interpretation, the institutional interest in maximizing the value of the data being collected, not the individual interest in maintaining control over their own information. This does not require assuming that any specific institution acted in bad faith. It requires only recognizing that when the interests of the institution and the interests of the individual diverge, the institution has considerably more resources, expertise, and influence over the design of the process than the individual does. The form is written by the institution. The terms are set by the institution. The disclosure language is drafted by the institution's legal team, within guidelines established by regulatory bodies that the institution has a significant role in shaping. The individual arrives at the process from outside it. They engage with a document they did not design, in a setting they did not control, under terms they are not well positioned to evaluate, and the outcome of that interaction reflects the imbalance, not necessarily through deliberate exploitation, but through a design process that was oriented, from the beginning, toward institutional needs. Some believe this incentive-based interpretation explains more than the structural fragility account does, because it accounts for the directional consistency of the pattern. If the problem were purely structural, you would expect the errors and discrepancies to be random, affecting institutional interests as often as individual ones. But the documented pattern is not random in that way. The discrepancies tend to occur in directions that benefit the institution's data position: broader data sharing, longer data retention, less accessible correction processes. That directionality, on the incentive-based view, is not coincidental. It reflects design choices made in environments where institutional interests were the primary consideration. Others disagree. They argue that the directionality of the pattern can be explained by the structural account without invoking institutional incentives. Systems that are designed to be efficient tend to be efficient in the direction of their primary function, which is data collection and processing. Correction and withdrawal are secondary functions. In any system where resources are limited, secondary functions receive less engineering attention than primary ones. The result is a system that is better at collecting and sharing data than it is at correcting or removing it, not because anyone designed it to be that way deliberately, but because that is what happens when a system is built primarily around one function and the others are addressed later and with less investment. But the third interpretation goes further than either of these, and it is worth examining carefully even though it is less commonly stated. It appears in academic literature and in the work of a small number of researchers who have looked at specific documented cases where the discrepancy in a person's record was not simply an error or an expansion of data sharing, but appeared to involve a shift in how the person was categorized or classified by the system. Not just wrong information, a different version of the person, a profile that did not match the individual's actual history, but that was internally consistent and that appeared to have been built from somewhere. On this interpretation, which is cautious and not widely accepted as a general explanation, certain form structures may be used, in specific cases, possibly deliberately, to establish an institutional version of an individual's identity that serves the institution's needs better than the individual's actual identity does. This is the explanation that the available evidence supports least completely. It is also the one that raises the most uncomfortable questions, because if it is accurate even in a subset of cases, it changes the nature of what the form represents. It is no longer simply a tool for collecting information. It is a mechanism for constructing a version of a person, and that construction, once entered into the system, has the same official status as a record that accurately reflects the individual's actual identity. The system does not distinguish between them. It processes both as records, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because assessing the third interpretation requires access to information about specific form designs and specific institutional processes that is not generally available to outside researchers. The cases where it finds some support are documented, but the documentation is incomplete. The chain of causation between a form structure and a specific record outcome is difficult to establish with the level of certainty that would be needed to make a confident claim. Most researchers who have noted this interpretation acknowledge its limitations as an explanation, while arguing that it cannot be fully ruled out on the basis of currently available evidence. That is a careful and honest position. It is also an unsatisfying one, because it leaves the question open without resolving it. What is perhaps most significant about the coexistence of these three interpretations is what it reveals about the state of understanding in this area. When multiple explanations each find partial support in the evidence, it usually indicates one of two things. Either the problem has multiple causes operating simultaneously, structural fragility in some cases, institutional incentives in others, and something more deliberate in a smaller subset, or the evidence currently available is not sufficient to distinguish between them. Both of those possibilities are genuinely possible here, and neither is comfortable from a policy perspective, because each implies a different kind of response. Some believe the answer lies in regulation, stronger data protection laws, more rigorous enforcement, clearer standards for what disclosure must include, and how accessible correction processes must be. On this view, the problem is one of insufficient external constraint on institutional behavior, and the solution is to tighten that constraint. Others argue that regulation alone cannot address a problem whose full scale is not yet understood. Regulating something you cannot fully observe is difficult, and if the most damaging aspects of the pattern are precisely those that are least visible, then regulation built on the visible cases may not reach the parts of the problem that matter most. Still others suggest that the answer lies in education, in building a population of people who understand identity systems well enough to engage with them more effectively, to read the relevant sections of the documents they sign, to understand the implications of the permissions they are granting, to make use of the correction rights they formally possess. That argument has merit, but it also has a limitation that has appeared repeatedly in this investigation. The gap between what people can realistically be expected to understand about these systems and what understanding them actually requires is not a gap that education alone can close. It is, in part, a design gap, and design gaps require design solutions. However, the timeline of how these different responses have developed does not fully match the scale of the problem as it is currently understood. Regulatory frameworks have been updated in several jurisdictions. Disclosure requirements have been tightened. Correction rights have been clarified. And yet the pattern of discrepancies continues to be documented. The structural vulnerabilities continue to be identified. The questions about institutional incentives and form design continue to be raised. The fact that the responses implemented so far have not resolved the pattern does not mean they have had no effect, but it does raise a question about whether the responses have been addressing the right dimensions of the problem, or whether the aspects of it that remain unaddressed are the ones that actually drive the pattern. What remains, when all of these interpretations are examined together, is a picture of a situation that is genuinely not fully understood, not by the individuals affected by it, not by the consumer advocates documenting it, not by the researchers studying it, and as many of the people responsible for managing identity systems have quietly acknowledged, not entirely by them either. That acknowledgement is not an admission of failure. It is a recognition of complexity, but it is also a recognition that carries weight, because the systems being described here are not marginal. They are the systems through which identity is confirmed, recorded, and relied upon in legal, financial, medical, and civic contexts. The stakes of not fully understanding them are not abstract. They are present in every form that is completed, every record that is processed, and every outcome that follows from a system that continues to operate at a scale and speed that its designers did not fully anticipate. At some point in any careful investigation, there is a moment where the accumulated evidence has to be looked at directly, not to produce a final answer, because in this case, a final answer does not yet exist, but to take stock of what is actually known, what remains uncertain, and what the distance between those two things means. That moment has arrived here, and it is worth approaching it carefully, because the temptation at this stage is either to overstate what has been established or to understate it. Neither serves the investigation. What serves it is a clear account of where things actually stand. And where they stand is more complicated than the official version of identity protection suggests, and more uncertain than the complete investigation would ideally leave them. Start with what is known. Identity, as it exists in the modern world, is not a fixed and stable thing held securely in a well-protected system. It is a distributed collection of records, held across multiple institutions, connected through networks that were built at different times and for different purposes, and processed through automated systems that operate largely out of the individual's view. The version of you that exists in databases, the one that institutions rely on when making decisions about your financial standing, your legal status, your eligibility for services, your medical history, is built from information that has traveled through multiple systems, been matched and merged and updated through processes you did not observe, and may contain details that do not fully reflect your actual history. That is not a speculative claim. It is a description of how these systems are designed and how they function in documented practice. It is also known that a single form can do more than it appears to do at the moment of completion. When a form is submitted to a financial institution, a government office, a healthcare provider, or any institution that operates within a connected data ecosystem, it enters a network. It triggers processes. It connects to records. It may authorize the collection and sharing of information beyond what the form itself visibly requests. These are not hidden processes in the sense of being secret. They are disclosed in documentation that accompanies the form, but they are hidden in a practical sense, because the documentation that discloses them is not designed to be read or understood by the people completing the transaction. The gap between what is technically disclosed and what is practically understood is real and has been documented across multiple research contexts. It is not a minor gap. It is a structural feature of how these processes operate. It is known that consent, as it currently functions in most identity-related documentation, does not consistently provide what it is officially supposed to provide. The legal framework built around consent assumes an informed individual who reads, understands, and deliberately agrees to what is being asked. The practical reality of how consent is obtained, in volume, in language that most people cannot fully interpret, in settings that do not invite careful reflection, does not match that assumption. This has been acknowledged in regulatory reviews, documented in academic research, and experienced directly by a significant number of people who have tried to understand what they agreed to and found the answer difficult to locate. Consent in these systems often functions as a formal record of a transaction rather than as a genuine exercise of individual control. That distinction is important, and it has not been resolved. It is known that errors in identity records are common, that they are not always minor, and that correcting them is frequently more difficult than the official process suggests it should be. The correction process, as it operates in practice, often places the burden on the individual to prove that the record is wrong, using the same system that contains the error. It is known that errors can propagate through connected systems, affecting multiple records, and sometimes affecting the records of people connected to the individual whose file originated the problem. It is known that the effects of record discrepancies can accumulate over time before they become visible, and that by the time they are noticed, the chain of consequences may be difficult to trace and more difficult to unwind. These are not theoretical vulnerabilities. They are documented outcomes that have affected real people in documented cases across multiple countries and multiple institutional contexts. And it is known that the pattern of these problems is not random. It is consistent enough, across enough different settings, that the explanation of isolated administrative error does not fully account for it. Researchers who have examined the pattern from different directions, technical, legal, economic, organizational, have arrived at observations that describe the same basic shape, even when they disagree about what that shape means. The pattern exists. It has been independently confirmed. What it reflects about the systems that produced it is where the agreement ends and the uncertainty begins. But this is where it becomes unclear, because alongside all of this documented knowledge, there are things that are genuinely not known, and that uncertainty is not a minor qualification at the edges of an otherwise complete picture. It is central to the picture. The full extent of the problem is not known, The documented cases represent the visible portion of a pattern whose total scale has not been measured. Most people who experience a record discrepancy do not report it to any research body or advocacy organization. Many do not recognize what happened to them as part of a broader pattern. Some do not notice that anything has changed at all. The cases that appear in the documented record are the ones where the problem became visible enough to prompt a response. The cases where it remained invisible, where the incorrect record continued to be processed as accurate, where the downstream effects accumulated without anyone noticing, those cases are not counted anywhere. Their number is unknown. It is not known what proportion of the documented discrepancies resulted from genuine technical failure, what proportion resulted from institutional design choices that prioritize data collection over individual transparency, and what proportion, if any, resulted from something more deliberate. The three interpretations examined in this investigation each find support in the evidence. None has been established as the dominant explanation, and the evidence needed to distinguish between them. Detailed access to institutional data architectures, form design histories, and internal decision-making processes is not generally available to outside researchers. That gap in the evidentiary record is not accidental. These are not publicly accessible systems. The decisions that shape them were made in technical and legal environments that are not transparent by design, and that lack of transparency is itself one of the features of the problem being investigated. It is not known whether the design of these documents, the placement of permissions, the structure of disclosures, the accessibility of correction processes, reflects negligence, competing priorities, or something more deliberate. Each of those explanations is possible. Each finds some support, and the question of which is most accurate matters, because it determines what kind of response would actually address the problem. Negligence calls for better technical standards and more careful system design. Competing priorities call for regulatory realignment, for changing the incentives that shape how institutions approach these decisions. Something more deliberate would call for something else entirely, and that something has not yet been clearly defined, partly because the possibility has not yet been openly and formally examined. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the question of whether any institution would agree to change a system that, in its current form, serves institutional interests well is not a question that can be answered from outside. The institutions involved in managing identity records occupy positions of significant influence over the regulatory processes that govern them. They employ legal teams that participate in drafting the standards they are then asked to meet. They contribute to the technical discussions that define what disclosure requirements look like in practice. The relationship between the regulated and the regulator, in this area as in many others, is not a relationship between fully independent parties. And that context shapes what changes are proposed, what changes are adopted, and what changes remain, year after year, as recommendations that have not been implemented. Some believe that meaningful change is possible within the existing framework, that better regulation, more rigorous enforcement, and clearer technical standards could address the most significant vulnerabilities without requiring a fundamental restructuring of how identity systems are designed. On this view, the problem is a matter of implementation. The principles are sound. The frameworks are adequate. What is needed is more consistent and more demanding application of what already exists. Others are less confident. They argue that the pattern documented across this investigation is not the result of implementation failures. It is the result of how the systems were designed, in environments shaped by interests that did not prioritize individual transparency. Better implementation of a flawed design, on this view, does not produce a sound system. It produces a more efficiently functioning version of the same flawed design. However, the timeline of reform efforts does not fully match the optimistic version of this story. Data protection frameworks have been strengthened in several major jurisdictions over the past decade. Consent requirements have been tightened. Access rights have been expanded. Correction procedures have been formalized. And yet, the researchers examining these systems continue to document the same structural vulnerabilities. The pattern that has been described across this investigation continues to appear in new cases, in new contexts, involving institutions that are operating within the updated frameworks. That does not mean the reforms had no effect, but it does mean that the effect was not sufficient to resolve what was being documented. And that gap between what the reforms aim to address and what they actually changed has not been fully accounted for in the public conversation about how these systems are governed. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the gap between regulatory intent and regulatory outcome is not just a policy detail. It is a signal about where the problem actually lives. If reforms that address disclosure requirements, consent standards, and correction rights did not resolve the pattern, then the pattern may be rooted in something that those reforms did not reach. What that something is, whether it is the architecture of connected systems, the incentive structures of the institutions that operate them, or something else, is a question that the current state of research has raised more clearly than it has answered. And this is where the investigation arrives at a point that is, in some ways, the most honest place it can reach. Not a resolution, not a definitive account of what is happening and why, but a clear statement of what is known, what is not known, and what the distance between those two things means for anyone trying to understand the relationship between a person and the official record that claims to represent them. What is known is substantial. What is not known is also substantial. And the systems at the center of this investigation continue to operate, processing forms, connecting records, producing outcomes, at a scale and speed that outpaces the rate at which the questions being raised here are being answered. There is a form somewhere in this picture. It may be sitting in a stack of documents waiting to be processed. It may already have been submitted. It may already be moving through a network, connecting to records, triggering updates, building a version of someone's identity in a system they cannot fully see. It looks ordinary. It looks like paperwork. It has fields for a name, an address, a date of birth. It has a signature line at the bottom, and sitting inside its language, in the terms that were disclosed but not explained, in the permissions that were granted but not fully understood, is a set of consequences whose full shape has not yet been mapped. What those consequences might be, how far they might reach, whether they reflect the intent of the people who designed the form or simply the logic of the system the form entered. Those questions remain open, and the fact that they remain open, after everything that has been examined, documented, and discussed, is perhaps the most significant finding this investigation has produced.